All right. Thanks once again, everyone, for making the time here. Um, I did make I made a couple requests, and maybe uh, not everyone was here. So it looks like everyone is doing this. So please go ahead and add your name to the attendee list. That's helpful. And then the other request is a review of the agenda. And maybe I'll open that up right now. If there are other things that folks would like to talk about, feel free to go ahead and shout out. Are we looking okay? All right. Have a subtle nod there, Julian. Thank you. Yeah, so maybe just in way of introduction, and it seems like we have sort of folks who've been on the line before, so it's probably not necessary to go into too much detail just in terms of introduction, but basically this is just the next, so we've been having a monthly call, or roughly monthly call, talking about this Oxford Common File System layout initiative, and I mean, I think we'll probably just go sort of straight into the details. I mean, if you're not aware, basically what we are doing is in a community-based fashion, trying to come up with a layout of digital repository objects, resources, in such a way that are meeting preservation needs, as well as what we are seeing is a growing collection of other use cases. That's probably not very concise or clear. I don't know if Andrew or anyone else wants to sort of add additional introduction there.
No, that sounds about right. I noticed that Simeon's in the agenda. Simeon's corrected us on presentation versus preservation centric layout. But yeah, I think that was the intended, is preservation centric layout, not presentation.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
Someone's been at too many IIIF meetings.
Okay, so I looking at agenda number 2, I know that there are a number of things, Andrew, that are sort of going on coming out of Oxford, but maybe before giving a brief update on those, I'm curious from others on the line here, if there are other related initiatives that that you feel like would be helpful to bring up here, because I think that one of the threads on this call is basically making this less of a report out and more of sort of a report out from just a couple of institutions and making it more of a community effort. And so it does seem that there quite likely are relevant initiatives going on beyond just what we've seen come out of Oxford. So I'm curious if anyone has balls in the air that are relevant here.
Emory, as part of planning for its digital library program, has created a document for structuring APEs, where we tried to keep things a little less about systems, which is kind of how the institution has previously done things, is talking about what things will look like in a system, and talked more about the abstract concepts that might fit in good with OCFL, so that, we're talked about like what types of metadata we would include in an APE, those types of things. My hope was that by delineating that, the technology team would be free to then pick whatever worked best for preservation and then for disseminating objects out to other systems, so like the Digital Preservation Network or AP Trust or something like that. So trying to kind of stay in line with what we have been talking about in the document that Andrew put together to make it a little bit easier once we have a good, hopefully, specification.
So is this a public document, Rosie?
It's not, but I could share it with the group. It is something that we were going to put on our wiki. So our digital library program has a wiki, and I could put that on the wiki sooner rather than later so that this group could take a look if they're interested in it. Okay, I will do that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Andrew, seemed like you had a
Yes.
clarifying question.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah. Sorry. What is an ape other than a primate?
Archival information package.
Oh, okay. Not AIP. Not
yes.
AP.
Ape.
Okay. Okay.
Ape, sip, dip.
Right. Okay.
Well, that actually brings a question to my mind. Is there any, and I've been able to attend some of the calls, but not all of them, but is there any intention of somehow addressing how the Oxford Common File System relates to OAIS?
I think yes. I think there'd be scope for identifying that and where that fits in OAIS. Sure.
I mean, the part of the reason that we structured the document the way we did was to say that there's two parts of the ape, and we specifically referenced OAIS, and then I believe we talked about file structure in the small group that wrote the document, and kind of left that off to the side and said, okay, that is something different. But what we wanted was more of what content goes into it, not really what it would look like, if that makes sense. So there may be kind of distinguishing between those two parts of the ape. So more of what you do with the content versus what's in the content.
Yeah, this is Scott. I'm kind of wondering about that also. If OAIS is fairly agnostic about, how the files are stored on the file system, just as long as you're able to describe that, it really doesn't care, as far as I understand OAIS.
Yeah, it seems like submission information packages and dissemination information packages maybe are outside of scope of what I feel like we've been talking about with CFL, and it maybe be more along the lines of what's in the middle, the apes. It seems like there could be a mapping there if there were particular interest. Yeah, it hasn't specifically come up in conversations as I recall. So I think it'd be a matter of if the team here feels like there's value in such a mapping.
The other thing, I don't think that OAIS necessarily even says that you need files for your apes. Last I looked at it, right? So you could conceivably have a structure of apes that isn't files, but most people tend toward files. I could be wrong.
I think that's right. I think it could be a physical object or a digital object. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Right. So it could be components that you pull together in different ways, but I think most people tend toward the files because a file is a little bit easier to structure than like saying it's here, there, everywhere, and you got to pull it together. And yeah.
Sure. I'm curious, Nathan, if you are coming from a specific perspective or use case where mapping it to OAS is particularly important.
It's not necessarily the mapping, but I think it's something that's best to get out in front of just to address how this fits, because I think it's going to be a very natural question for people to think. You know, OIS is sort of the you know, the de facto abstract model for thinking about this content and how you preserve it. And so just something as simple, either in the paper, an introductory material or preface or whatever, that, you know, this is intended to specifically talk about how you store those AIPs as part of the OAIS model. Might be enough, but that's what got me thinking about it, because, oh, this is a preservation focused repository. I'm trying to follow OAIS. How does this meld together?
Sure.
Yeah, I think you're totally right that our SIPs and DIPs are probably outside of the scope here. And we're really just talking about how we're storing those apes, but just something as simple as that up front is all I'm thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, thanks, and thanks, Rosie, for the update and the link that will be coming at some point to the work that you all have done at Emory.
I actually, it is online.
That was fast.
Yeah, I have a guy who's amazing.
Well, maybe if you could just put a link into the notes. So, and speaking of notes, I'll try to sort of capture some bullets, but it's hard to talk and also jot down notes. So if people could contribute here on the agenda
I'll
page
put it
also.
In both the
Great.
notes and then.
I'm curious from other folks on the line here, are there other local initiatives that would be good to bring up here?
At Penn right now, we're starting to have conversations with folks in our special collections department. There is a discovery and presentation focused online collection. I'd hesitate to call it a repository because it values access online, and it's really largely a file system, just a plain old file system sitting underneath it. And the goal within the next year is to get that discovery layer streaming content directly from our Fedora-based preservation repository. So we're looking at what is interesting here is the way that we are preserving our files and sort of linking to them from within Fedora. We're using Git and Git Annex to version our apes, and Git Annex is an extension for Git that allows you to track versions, changes over time to large files without actually checking them into Git. It uses a key value store where it derives the key in part from the SHA-256 checksum. And so we have something that already, like the pile paths are intentionally opaque, and they're feeding from an external storage cluster. And so to be able to port the required functionality of this discovery system that really lives and dies by what the file paths are, and they need to be predictable because the way the researchers use the content. So we're looking at that, and I'm hoping that we can use the recommendation that comes out of this working group as a way to make both of these systems play nicely without just creating a morass of symlinks or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Kate. Others? Are you on the verge of something, Julian, or am I misreading that expression?
I'm typing furiously into the document. But not about this explicit thing, because all my initiatives are already up there.
Okay. All right. So I know, Andrew, there are several updates coming out of Oxford. Maybe this is appropriate time to raise those.
Sure. So we're currently in the middle of redoing quite a few of our large digital systems. And one of those is our institutional repository system, which I don't deal with. Is another team, Tom Roble, who's on the call as well, helps manage that. But on our digital Bodleian site, we have, that's where we display and serve our images and do our digital image preservation. And as part of both of those, we're trying to normalize our file system. We have large file disk-based arrays where we store files, and both of those systems store things in completely different ways. So we're trying to sort of become more standardized with ourselves in that. So we're looking at a couple internal initiatives to help support OCFL, to bring it to do community support for OCFL, so supporting the process, supporting the speccing, and writing software to support it, so validators or client libraries, and that sort of thing. So there's no money right now, but we're working on that bit, and we're really interested in helping to move the community forward with that, because it helps us, but we don't want to just do things in an Oxford specific way. We want to make sure that we do it in a way that helps everybody. So so we're interested in helping to support the community, but we want to make sure everybody's in on it as well. That's it. that's my update.
Yeah, and this kind of, for me at least, brings it back to agenda item number 4, and so and you didn't get into the details, Andrew, of the sort of the details of the timeline necessarily, but Oxford is apparently moving forward with things here, and I guess what I'm interested in is, from the community perspective, how can we work together in terms of defining things and basically shaping the OCFL specification and potentially collaborating on implementations of tooling around that specification, such that it does do what you were raising, Andrew, sort of meets community needs. So that's kind of my broader question for the folks here on the team is one around community engagement. What makes sense for people on the line here, and how can and what makes sense from your perspective, Andrew and Tom, of basically working collaboratively in the context of things are moving forward.
Is that a question for me? Or is
Well,
that
I think it's a question for everyone, really, yeah.
Okay. Then I'll let somebody else speak.
I really like the concept of validators that you threw out. I think that's a great place for anybody with a certain amount of development time to put a toehold in. Because you could think about like validators for dead simple file structures versus validators where there's some sort of complicated object structure involved. And I mean, like that would be definitely, like, as I mentioned, if we're going to start using the spec at Penn, that would certainly be something that we would need to do. And I think doing it in a way that's not just like institutionally specific and putting it out there for the community, that would be a great way.
Yeah, I really like the idea of a validator also. And I'm wondering if maybe a good first step would be just get a bunch of kind of sample objects, perhaps apes that people have generated from their own systems, that we could then, organize in a, straw man OCFL format and use that to develop a validator against. Sort of the idea of gathering a use case, but a use case is expressed in, an actual content of objects.
And I just want to throw out, so we just finished writing validators for Moab like a month ago. So we can now validate the structure of MARB on disk. We knew our stuff was good anyway, and it was, but we can now validate that it's good. So maybe that's something that could be extended, because it looks like OCFL is at the moment just a superset of MOAB. So assuming you guys are okay writing in Ruby, it'll be pretty easy to extend.
I'm not. Sorry. No, I think it really comes down to which cart we put before which horse. You know, which comes first, the validator or the data, and which comes first, the data or the use cases, and which comes first, you know, the use cases or the spec. You know, all these things. I think we could start at any point and say, oh yeah, well, we're starting at the right place. So I'd be interested to sort of work out together where should we start? Should we start just by gathering a bunch of apes and sticking them together into a big pot, or should we start at the use case gathering? Should we start writing the spec first and then building the validators against it? I'm a bit allergic to the idea of writing software before we have anything written down, but that could just be me. So I'd really be interested to know and to work out where we can go practically from here.
Well, I think, as I've said in a couple of comments on the agenda and the docs, a bit of a focus on the use cases would be where I would start, to try and define the boundaries of what is trying to be achieved a little better.
I agree. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think collecting apes is similar to that, developing use cases, right? It's looking at existing use cases, if that's how you want to phrase it. But I think the two things are very much related, and spending some time doing that is not going to make things worse. I could be wrong though.
Yeah, and I like the idea of kind of linking the two together, the use cases and the apes, or the actual data that we want to verify, because I've seen quite a few projects that kind of get stalled at the use case where, you know, there's like a prose description of, well, here's what we want to do, but then it never moves beyond to actual data that needs to get worked with. But I think having a use case combined with, and here's an ape that, you know, is a product of this use case, that gives us a really nice starting point for both validator, and like Andrew said, before we validate, we should probably have some sort of spec that the validator is validating with.
Yeah, so hopefully it's clear. There is a link in the agenda number 6 to the location where use cases are being collected in the form of GitHub issues. And as noted, the use cases, for the most part, that are in there right now are basically extracted directly from the discussion paper. So it would be good to get even more use cases from others. So if you could please just add them directly to the GitHub repository, I think that would be a great start. I'm also curious about collecting sample objects, and I see that being useful, and it would be, as mentioned, useful to then tie those two use cases, and it might help just sort of clarify some of the discussion and some of the text of the discussion paper, actually. And I'm curious if it probably depends on the size of these things, but I was sort of leaning towards the possibility of pulling those into GitHub as well, unless people think that collecting that in some other location makes more sense. And if people actually have, if maybe there are a handful of volunteers of sample objects, just sort of to get some actions on the table. I saw We have one taker, Andrew.
This is Scott. I might be interested in providing a couple of samples of some of our Fedora 3 objects, because I see, this initiative as being, really interesting in sort of a migration path off of Fedora 3 at some point.
Mm-hmm.
We have some spec files, sample MARB objects that are in our public repo that are available for use. I can try to dig up the link for that. It's in one of our preservation catalog initiatives.
That'd be helpful. Thank you. Does anyone else have content that maybe we could throw into the mix here?
I can send one of my one of the objects from within our repo that's using Annex for versioning, and that's probably going to be the most helpful, if that would be.
Yeah. Okay, and so maybe we just need to make it clear where in the GitHub, assuming that that's okay, these should land. And I can take that.
Yeah, I mean, we could open it up to people if they request it, or if you wanted to submit a pull request or something to accept it in, that would also be a possibility. Or if something else is better.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks all. Looking at the chat here, is anything going on? Hi, Declan. So I put in here agenda item number 3. I thought it was an interesting comment by Andrea in the discussion paper, basically noting that it would be helpful sort of towards the top of the document to have a succinct statement around the problem or problems that OCFL is trying to solve. And I mean, I think that would just generally be helpful, for clarifying the topic to people, and maybe more so people who aren't on this call, or even on this call, just sort of trying to make sure that we're on the same page. And we don't necessarily need to do anything with that right now, although it would be good maybe in the notes section here just to do kind of some brainstorming or throwing in some key phrases that people feel like start to capture the real the crux of the problem that OCFL is trying to solve. Because I think the discussion paper does a lot around describing the solution, but it seems less so that we have a clear statement of the problem.
I think in the statement that's written now, I would remove the parentheses around or cloud storage, because I think cloud storage should be a first order priority as part of the problem. We understand that cloud storage is a reality in a lot of libraries.
Seems reasonable.
This is Ben at Brown. I think for us, a big motivation is to prevent fairly large-scale data migrations, to have it laid out once and then migrate systems, not the data.
Yeah, would you mind jotting some notes here at the bottom? Maybe.
Sure.
It looks like Andrew, you're capturing a little bit of that. Thank you. Yeah, any sort of just while it might be on your mind right now, in any sort of phrases or concepts that we'd like to capture here in the problem statement.
I think it's important that we're able to retrieve the data, the objects, the information that we're storing without having any, without having to go through any particular piece of software. We should be able to just use file system, operating system utilities to get at the data.
Do bash scripts count?
Well, bash is really kind of file system. But,
Yeah,
I mean,
and it's a fuzzy line.
yeah, I'm thinking, somebody may implement OCFL, on Windows or Mac or some as yet uncreated operating system. Just, making it as simple as possible without having to have any special software you need to be able to put things on, get things out, and look at it.
Yeah, and I'm sort of thinking of how to cast that as a sort of like a thing that we're trying to solve or address. It seems like it's something we want, I guess.
So one problem that we're sort of grappling with here is what properties, when we have the apes, we have a repo. We want to make sure that should we lose the repo, we can reconstruct it using just the apes. But where's that line? For example, we're implementing preservation policies for apes, so that we can say that any one particular ape will have 4 copies and they will be stored on these types of media, on these types of vendors, tape or S3 or local disk or what have you. Is that a property of the ape or is it a property of the repo? And therefore, if it's a property of the ape, we need to capture that somehow in the ape, so that's, the ape is whole. And if it's a property of the repo, then is that something that we need to worry about to reconstitute the repo in the event of data loss? I don't have an answer, that's just the problem we're working with.
So Julian, I would say that is exactly the sort of scope-defining question we should write up as a use case and talk about. So, my answer, reading through things so far and thinking about it, is that that's at a level above what OCFL is trying to do. But to get a shared understanding on an answer like that would be really, really helpful in defining how to take this forward.
Okay, then.
I'm at a loss of where to put that in the notes. Is that part of the statement of the problem?
Yeah.
But I think you're right, Simeon, and Julian. I think in the discussion paper, I make it clear that things like expecting OCFL to solve a Fedora to DSpace migration shouldn't happen. You shouldn't be able to use it as a migration between repositories or some other platform. So you can't use it as sort of a generic data store for all sorts of digital content. You do have to make decisions of what goes in it. It's just when things go in it, if you apply software on top of it, then it should know how to understand it. Is that sort of what you were thinking of, Julian?
I think it's certainly a component of it.
Yes.
But I must admit, I do not have a concise, precise definition of this problem myself. It's just, it's in my head, it's in Lynn's head, it's on some Google Docs someplace, and that's about it.
Yeah, well, maybe that's just something that we can continue to take up, is sort of refining what such a statement might eventually look like. Because I think it's fruitful conversation in terms of getting people in the same space. All right, maybe we just sort of carry on here. So I think we've already talked in a couple of ways about trying to transition the effort to be more inclusive to the community and effective for the community. And so at this point, there are a few resources. There's the discussion paper. There are use cases. We are collectively collecting content that ideally will tie into the use cases. We have these somewhat regular calls. I'm curious if there those of you all who feel like that there's something that we can do to be more effective in terms of making sure that it's a collaborative process. Is there more communication? Is there sort of more ownership that can be transferred to the team? You might be on mute.
Sounds like you're doing a great job doing all the communication, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I'm interested to hear what folks' ideas are.
This has been, again, it might be helpful once we have, if we have more of a timeline and milestones, like for getting to a full spec and then software that works with the spec. If we had a rough timeline that we were aiming for, that may help draw people in or help with community.
At Brown, Ben, are you all working against any sort of timeline? In this context, I assume you are. In a variety of other contexts.
We don't have a hard timeline. No, we're interested in at what point, like OCFL specs and software will be available, and and as it moves forward, we may be able to contribute to that and help make it happen, and that could be a next step for us. But we don't have a hard timeline that we have from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So Simeon, I'll take it from the other perspective, and I'm sort of engaging with this work because I'm assuming that something pretty concrete will happen in the next year, say, and that's a timeline that I'm interested in thinking about these things on.
Currently, I was wondering if, hope you can hear me. I'm coming in a little bit late here. I've been puzzling at the top of the document, and I hoping to come up with a statement that I thought I'd like to just propose as a draft sort of audience statement. If you look at the top, I put it in italics. It seems like it's preservation centric, but it doesn't necessarily exclude cloud storage. And it shouldn't exclude it, but I would say that I think this spec that we're doing would be of interest to people who are implementing digital object repositories that tend to prioritize, but maybe not exclusively, tend to prioritize preservation and storing file-oriented objects using ordinary file system tools and metaphors. So, for example, you wouldn't use our spec if you had a vast sprawling system that was scattering fragments across the different data centers that needed special purpose tools to reassemble them. Or you wouldn't use this spec for that part of that solution. So I'm hoping to say something that says you can use this for ordinary repositories, preservation or not, but it'll tend to want to be preservation because this, we believe, sort of the long-term strategy seems to play out well for these ordinary file system tools and metaphors. I don't know if this resonates with people, but I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, no, thanks, John. Well, it seems like it does echo well, some of what I've heard Scott say here on the call and others. Thank you for sort of putting it down.
It does seem like there will be people who will say, "Oh, you guys are crazy. You don't. We can't possibly afford to keep things in this format." But I think there are a large number of us on this call. We're dealing with, I don't want to use the word boutique collections. I want to use sort of more deliberately managed repositories with curators and collection decisions, acquisition decisions, judgments. We're not doing the fire hose preservation, but it's important that this file system metaphors are useful in these cases, but they're not useful in a lot of cases that we can all think of. And trying to build a statement that doesn't exclude a bunch of people who want to use this layout, but they're not doing preservation. That's also possible.
Hence the phrasing of tending towards.
Yeah, tend to prioritize.
Mm-hmm.
That's why, so it's designed for that, with that in mind, as a kind of broad use case. And that's as far as I got in my thinking about use cases, which is not at all specific, but it's this broad thing.
Yeah, well, it's easy for me to imagine sort of a variation of that showing up in the discussion paper or in towards the top of the specification or what however the documents evolve. Seems like having an audience statement is helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so any other discussion around what we can do to be more collaborative and community inclusive, or around problem statement or the like? If not, maybe agenda item number 5 here is taking looking at the clock, a relatively quick look at the discussion paper with a focus on maybe the comments that have been made there, just making sure that some of the points that people have raised, we're giving time to speak to them if some clarification or discussion would be valuable, if that makes sense for folks. So I'm assuming that it's okay. So sort of scrolling down here from the top, there was a suggestion, and we can sort of mass accept the possibility here of changing from institutional repository to digital repository, or maybe as John used in his audience statement, digital object repository, if that sort of makes more sense or is less exclusionary.
I kind of like the idea of just making it digital repository or digital object repository. Institutional repository can have a specific connotation to people about the content inside it, and I think we are agnostic about content.
Yep. Yeah, I think, Simeon, you're making a similar point.
Yeah, we use institutional repository here mainly to talk about DSpace, and so it's acquired a meaning over time that maybe it's unintended, but I like the idea of using digital repository.
Okay, and we can move on to the next comment, but is there sort of a general leaning towards digital repository versus digital object repository, one or the other? I mean, sort of wordsmithing at this point, but didn't know if there's strong opinions.
I'd say stick with the simpler term. There's enough talk about objects later on.
Got it?
Yeah. Economy.
Okay, and then Andrea has this comment that I think we already gave plenty of time to, or at least as much as we could, given the time that we have, around having a problem statement. So thanks there. Scrolling down, Rosie, you have a comment around metadata.
I think Rosie went to the Sandera call.
Goodbye, Rosie. And actually, I think that it was resolved. I think she's just commenting on some wordsmithing that she did that was accepted. So maybe that's all good.
Andrew, could I
yes.
jump back for a second to community collaboration? I'm just wondering if there's any thought yet about presenting on this work at open repositories or NDSA digital preservation. I think either of those would be a good crowd to engage more in the community, and maybe those who aren't typically on these more technical calls.
Yeah, I don't know if Julian or Andrew, you want to speak to that?
Sure. So we have a panel arranged for open repositories. I will be there. Julian will be there, and
Don Brower,
Rosie. And Rosie will be presenting there. But it will be sort of an open. We're sort of thinking of structuring it as a bit of an open discussion with some summary of what we've talked about so far. But yes, we will be opening it up to that community.
Perfect. Thanks.
But the NDSA meeting, maybe that's one that we had not talked about. I don't know if Nathan or others are sort of actively involved or connected there and would be interested in putting forward a proposal.
I am involved in NDSA. I don't have the bandwidth to necessarily plan or be too much of a participant in a panel discussion, but I'm happy to help facilitate in any way if that's useful to people, or to push something through, whatever.
Yeah, well, maybe if I can ask that you just sort of raise to this group and maybe on the PASIC discuss list, like flag when proposals are being accepted, for example.
They are open now. I will pass it on today.
All right, and so looking through comments here, Simeon, and I scrolled down a little ways, you sort of raising the fact that we seem to be using objects in at least two different contexts, sort of maybe the intellectual entity as well as the digital object, and I don't know if there's any suggestion there for actually teasing those apart.
I'm wondering, this is Scott, if within the scope of the OCFL, we want to talk more about just the digital object and the bits that make it up, and not worry about intellectual entity, because it seems to me like modeling the intellectual entity happens at a higher level than what the OCFL is concerned with.
Yeah, and so maybe sort of pinpointing where we cross that line into maybe intellectual entity discussion, and either make that very clear, or maybe just make it clear that that's what's being talked about in those cases. Just sort of scrolling through, and maybe if there are comments that people want to highlight, that could also be useful here.
Just on the subject of the object, the first paragraph under design principles says an OCFL digital object. I mean, I know that nomenclature doesn't sort of pervade the whole document, but the idea is that it's a collection of files and folders. There are files and metadata that can have a notional idea of a thing, and whether or not that corresponds to a single physical object or if it's, something else. I think we're fairly agnostic about that, but the OCFL digital object there's a paragraph on what that is there already, but it could certainly be made better.
Yeah, and then maybe I think Simeon, if you're still on the line, seemed like was just sort of highlighting maybe the flip side, cases where maybe we're not, we use the term object, but we're not actually talking about OCFL digital objects, and clarifying those cases.
Yeah, sorry, I stepped out for a second. I was just wanting to sort of think forward without actually putting the effort in to try and clarify throughout, but I think we need to.
All right, so and I am cognizant of the clock, and there are a couple other things that we want to talk about, but before we get away from the discussion paper here, let me just sort of leave it up to you all who may have left comments or have comments. Is there anything that you would like to raise or be useful to briefly discuss right now? Seems likely. I know, it looks like Simeon, Julian, John.
I guess I did have a sort of minor procedural thing that I would suggest actually ripping the use cases out of the document at this point in order to focus the discussion on the GitHub issues. Having two places is kind of destined to lead to confusion.
Agreed. Since they have effectively been copied over, so that seems pretty straightforward. I don't know if Andrew, if you're interested in doing that.
Sorry, I flashed a thumbs up, but you
sorry,
probably covered my face with a screen or something. Yes, I will do that.
Awesome. Okay. And any other? Sorry for being rushed here. Discussion paper comments.
I have lots of comments, but we have 6 minutes left, so.
Yeah. Fair enough. Okay, and so let me just sort of throw another pitch out for agenda item number 6. Please do add your use cases, and I think that in previous calls we have had the good fortune of hearing from a number of institutions, and for the most part, not completely, but for the most part, things that people are already doing, basically solutions that are in place. And I think what would be helpful, one thing that would be helpful here, if we could collect use cases that maybe highlight aspects of a current solution that need to be considered from OCFL's perspective. And so there are many of you all who have discussed your solutions, and so maybe just an ask here for adding some use cases that highlight where OCFL might be having gaps, basically. So I feel like there are those sets of use cases, and then we have another group of people who are looking for solutions and using OCFL as a potential way forward. And so in that context, if folks can add use cases for the type of system or the type of layout or whatever the characteristics of your use case are, coming from that perspective too, of we need a system and it needs to address these scenarios. So just a collective action there. So maybe just, I don't think we have maybe a lot of time to talk about agenda item number 7. Simeon, your point is well taken, that use cases will hopefully drive a lot of the specification drafting, and hopefully those use cases will begin to flourish. But also noting that, and this sort of goes along the lines of community engagement, it will be helpful to start to define roles and ideally some level of commitment in a few different areas. One around an editorial team once we get to that level, and then contributors, kind of like what we're asking for here, use cases, etc. And then when it would be good if there are points of collaboration and joint effort when it comes to implementation when it gets to that point. So maybe just sort of planting the seed for people to keep it in mind that having these teams will be very helpful. And then timeline and milestones. I know Andrew Oxford has a somewhat strong sense of a timeline, and the milestones. It's less clear to me what those are, but it seems like you all have a relatively aggressive timeline, and it would be nice if we could align that with community effort as well.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a fairly strong internal desire to get this going, but I think we're also going to be comfortable with implementing drafts and betas and sort of catching up, helping work through some of the issues. So I don't think I wouldn't like to set them out publicly, because I don't want to actually push the community towards a timeline that they're not comfortable with.
That's nice of you. Okay, so and then the one last thing is, well, agenda item number 8. There are several of us who will be at Stanford for LAM Dev Con X. And so I think the idea there is that the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday typically are sort of unconference sessions. So we'll pitch to have an unconference session, and then ideally on Thursday or Friday, maybe get together a group of folks for a half day or even a full day possibly to start to dig in on details around the discussion paper, around the use cases, and formalizing things, and ideally taking advantage of the opportunity to be there with the Stanford team and digging a bit into Moab and make sure that what OCFL is proposing, which does diverge a bit from Moab, is not sort of losing something in the process.
Yeah, don't break my Moab.
Yes, there it is. And then you probably have noticed on GitHub there's no logo. So those of you who are logoists, your contributions would be greatly appreciated. Right now it's just one of those Space Invaders sort of things. But and then so I'll go ahead and announce on the LDCX list. I'll announce on the PASIC Discuss list what's going on with LDCX, and then also when the next call like this will be. But folks have to leave, I see, and thanks for once again making the time and being here. And hopefully we'll see each other at the end of the month. But even if not there, we'll talk soon. So thanks all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye now.
Thank you, Andrew.